So the second part of this is, like I said before, is how the study that Chuck gave that background on, how that affected the regulations. So Ken's going to talk about that. Ken is a mining engineer with USBM RI, where he's worked on coal mine blasting related issues since 1989. He provides technical assistance and advice to the states, investigates citizen complaints, and evaluates the adverse effects of blasting on people and property. He's an instructor for OSM technical training classes on blasting, mine gases, GPS, and public relations. As the OM Blaster Certificate Coordinator, Ken administers the OSM Blaster Certificate Program and helps states and other federal agencies conduct blaster certification and continuing education training. Ken is a past director of ISEE and has chaired the Blast Vibration and Seismograph section in public education and public relations committees. He is the current chair of the ISEE Standards Committee. Still.
Hey, thank you, Nathan. Good afternoon. Welcome to the raising of the Z. This is a tale about a piece of research that has significantly impacted the existence of the regulatory universe. And I want to give you a little bit of a historical perspective on how it has come about. You know, I mean, or basically Chuck has told you how it come about. I want to tell you how it's been used, how it's evolved, and how it's influenced what we do, okay? And in addition to that, I would like to have you walk away with a little understanding of how rules are generated, some of the things that need to be considered along the way, and just understand where my agency has come from as well, as the Office of Surface Mining and Reclamation. And that takes us back a little bit to the 1970s, all right? And what was in existence in the 70s? Chuck just talked about 8507 being published in 1980. Obviously, the research for that particular unit had been ongoing for some time during the mid-70s. Early on, there was Bureau Bulletin 656, which basically set that 2 inches per second standard. All right, and that was generally applied across the board. In terms of blasting seismographs, we had things like falling pin seismographs. Who's ever seen a falling pin seismograph? A number of you, okay. Had spring nethers, which were earthquake seismographs. You know, then we got into reel-to-reel and tape units, you know, cassette tapes. Technology has evolved significantly since then. But this tale talks about the equipment. It starts with the equipment that was available at that point in time and the mining that was occurring at that point in time as well. So where were we, you know, as they were developing and doing the research for 8507 in the 1970s? Well, from a coal mining standpoint, you know, this was the era of minimal or little regulation from a national perspective on reclamation or on blasting. The predominant mining method of the day was to shoot and shove. As we've got on this little schematic over here, cross section, on a particular contour cut, this area was simply drilled, shot over the hill, and the little bit that was remaining on the bench was further shoved over the hill. Coal was extracted, and then if they were kind, they would come back in and place a bit of backfill over top of the pavement to minimize the formation of acid mine drainage. So obviously, you know, that was an issue at the time. There was a lot of congressional testimony that came out that said we need to start to protect our lands, not only from a reclamation standpoint, but also from a blasting standpoint. Some of the states, like Pennsylvania and Kentucky, have had long-standing regulatory programs on blasting. Those limits universally were set at 2 inches per second in the mid-70s, but it certainly wasn't applied broadly from a national perspective, all right? As we talked about, those limits were pretty much codified in U.S. Bureau of Mines Bulletin 656, all right, based on the work that they had done, or a scale distance of 50 at that point in time, which roughly equates to 2 inches per second in most blasting applications, all right? So how did we get pushed into not only a blasting standard, but also a reclamation standard? Well, it all started with the Arab oil embargo of 1973, all right? And there was a smaller event in 79, but I'm gonna focus on 73. And what's interesting is if you look at the coal production over time from 1950 to 2010, and you look at what happened where coal production was in about 1973, we were at about 400,000 tons, 500,000 tons on an annual basis. And when there were long lines at the gas stations and people were concerned about energy independence, the government took on initiative to promote or move from coal or oil to coal, natural gas, and or nuclear power. So at that point in time, what happens to coal production? You see this constant rise up to well over 1 billion tons on an annual basis being produced, all right, and a similar rise in electric power, all right? Before 77, production was relatively flat in that interval, okay? But what happened in 73 when the price of coal went up significantly? Anybody that had a backhoe, what do you think they became? They became a coal miner, all right? You now had power to mine coal that was at $70 or $80 a ton, I think, if I recall correctly, at that point in time, all right? And there were lots of people that became very rich at that point in time as well. But the mining methodology with no reclamation and the blasting, shoot and shove philosophy pushed Congress ultimately in 1977 to pass the Surface Mining Control and Reclamation Act, okay? And this was because so many lands were simply being spoiled as a result of mining activity, and so many people were complaining about damage to their structures from a blasting perspective, all right? So it's going to focus only on coal mining, but the Surface Mine Control and Reclamation Act, which created the Office of Surface Mining Reclamation and Enforcement, pertained to only mining of coal. And Congress made it very clear at the onset, its main mission was to not only protect the environment, but to balance the energy needs of the country with the reclamation standards, all right? So, and that's sort of referenced in our logo on the right-hand side, scales of justice. One side you've got a pile of coal, the other side some trees. So balance the needs of the country from a land use standpoint with the needs of the energy, with the energy needs of the country, okay? So, and the other thing that it did was level the playing field for reclamation standards. At this point in time, there were some states that had reclamation standards. There were some that didn't. One state, by having a lower standard, could promote the business in their backyard a little bit more than in the adjacent state. So they were a bit more competitive, their employment was a little bit better. This helped level the playing field and help preserve the lands of the United States. But it also built in, because of the large public outcry, in particular the Appalachian area, about blasting related issues, okay? In terms of property protection is one of its components, and we'll talk about the verbiage therein. And it also was the law that brought about the need or requirement for certifying blasters to ensure that blasts perform safely over the course of mining operations. So what did the Surface Mining Act tell us we had to do from a blasting perspective? And here again, this is all headed towards how we're going to use 8507 to build a regulatory program. So what did Congress tell us we had to do? Okay, we had to promulgate regulations. And I'm not going to read this whole thing, but the number one item here was they had to blast, basically, limit blasting, the type of explosive detonating equipment, so as to prevent injury to persons and damage to public and private property outside the permit area. So we primarily here are going to focus on the damage to public and private property outside the permit area from a ground vibration standpoint. Fly rock can certainly damage property off-site as well as air blast, but the purpose of the discussion is the ground vibration. So how did those vibration standards come to be through the regulatory process? Because fundamentally what Congress does is tell the government employees, here's what you need to do, I want you to do this, and then we promulgate regulations to talk about how we're going to do that. So there's some challenges in writing those regulations, and Chuck touched on some of this already. But when you're trying to make a national rule, and you look at the US map over here where coal mining, any place they're mining coal in the United States, these rules are going to apply. And across the United States, there's certainly a huge number of different environments in which mining's taking place. There's a wide variety of different types of structures. There's residential structures, there's trailers, there's engineered structures, there's pipelines, there's power lines, there's hogans, different traditional structures. So any rule that we're going to make to basically implement the will of Congress, which is to ensure they blast in such a way that there's no damage to public or private property outside the permit area, is relatively challenging. All right. So what do we have to do? We're going to create a national rule, and Congress decided that since it's so complicated from a national perspective, we're going to give the states the individual rights to basically implement our rules. So OSM gives those responsibilities back to the states, but we do set a basic set of guidelines that they've got to follow. Those guidelines need to be scientifically based. And in this instance, what are we going to use? We're going to use 8507, because that was the primary document that was coming out at that point in time. You got to make rules that can be implemented, and the equipment needs to be available to monitor for those activities. If you don't have a water meter that can sample pH, well, you can't set a rule on pH. And the same is true with blasting. If the machines don't provide, like Chuck talked about, the frequency information readily in the field to show compliance with the Z curve, you really can't promulgate a regulation that goes to that as a primary means of establishing compliance. And that's one of the keys in this whole thing, is in 1980, the limitations of the equipment at the time, and one of the main reasons OSM didn't straight out adopt the Z curve, all right? We also have to take a look at economic impact. Is the equipment affordable? Is it available, readily available to the industry in the field so that they can actually use it in a non-onerous fashion? It's deployable, okay? And certainly attainability. And the key is, whatever rules that we do set, it's got to provide for a high level of damage prevention, our probability of non-damage, okay? Because as Chuck was talking about, everything that we do in this, science part of our universe, it's all probability based, statistically based, and you never really get to that 0 point. You get pretty close, but it's not always there. So we can't absolutely draw a line in the sand and say on one side you're going to be good, on the other side you're not going to be good, because it's not a clear line because of all the variables that Chuck just talked about. All right, so what are we going to talk about? I'm going to talk about 77 real quick. Congress said, okay, you got to be in business in 90 days. You put together some interim rules, implement those until you get a permanent regulatory program established. The first iteration was in 1979. In 1980, I'm going to talk about each one of these individually. 1980, the courts overturned those rules, and you'll see how that is. 83, we went to our second iteration, adoption of the rules, which are still standing today. They were challenged once in 1993 with a Zell petition. And basically what that is anybody in this room, if you don't like a rule that you have, you can petition the government to change it. So just, keep that in mind. It's meant to be a dynamic environment and change with the times and the equipment. And you as industry people or emerging professionals can take that, any new research that's from these conferences or whatnot, and petition the government to change their existing rules. All right, and then, where are we today in terms of the regulatory stuff? All right, so in 1977, here again, before the publications of 8507, certainly they were well on their way at this point in time of putting together 8507. They had gathered a lot of the data. They had compiled some of their preliminary thoughts, and the US Bureau of Mines and OSM had some lengthy discussions about what they're doing and how we could implement the best technology currently available at that point in time into the regulatory scheme. All right? So based on those initial discussions, we came up with a prohibition of blasting within 1,000 feet of structures, and peak particle velocities in all instances would have to be less than 1 inch per second. What was the reigning particle velocity limit at that point in time? 2 inches per second. Huge reduction, a halving of the allowable ground vibration level that the industry had up until that point in time. And we said that, okay, if, based on, the population density, land use, age of structures, geology, or frequency of blasting, the level could be lowered by the regulatory authority if, in fact, they found that that was appropriate to ensure prevention of damage. But the key is that it was incumbent on the regulatory authority, the states or OSM, to do that. It's a pretty tall order to fill because none of the regulators at that point in time had anywhere near the necessary experience to be able to do that, okay? The other component, in addition to the 1 inch per second, was a scale distance of 60. Okay, and I've already touched on the discussion with US Bureau of Mines personnel. Key was discussion. This information hadn't been published yet. Courts do not look very favorably upon information that's not published. They call that hearsay, all right? So what happened in 1980, a judge overturned the 77 rules, which said 1 inch per second was the lay of the land, and made us go back to the 2 inches per second limit at that point in time, because that was what was justified in US Bureau of Mines Bulletin 656. All right, so it explains a lot in terms of, explains why rules are hard to change, because they have to be based on information that's published, okay? So, they also overturned the blasting within 1,000 feet prohibition, all right? And that's sort of a sidebar, but there was only a prohibition in the act of mining within 300 feet. We tried to extend it to 1,000 feet, and they said, no, you can't do that. Congress didn't authorize you to do that. But that, again, was in part meant to help protect buildings from being damaged from blasting, all right? So it basically forced us to go back and rethink our process after those rules were overturned in 1980. Again, keeping a timeline in mind, about the same time that RI 8507 had actually hit the street and was available for comment. And certainly the Bureau did take a huge amount of heat for that document. A lot of legal action, a lot of people asserting that this is going to put the mining industry out of business. Did it do that? No. It didn't. It ended up being something that was fully able to be implemented, but the vibration levels that they recommended there, as with many new things, it simply takes time. All right. So once it was overturned in 1980, OSM sort of goes back to the drawing board. 8507 hits the street. All right. We require anticipated blast designs within 1,000 feet of blasting operations. When blasting operations are within 1,000 feet of homes, okay? But that's meant more as an early warning signal to the regulatory people that they're getting close to houses. It doesn't limit how they're blasting as a general rule. But we did go back, and since this was published, we took a look at it and we set vibration limits that were based on frequency and particle velocity and based on the type of structure that exists. 8507 predominantly covers residential structures of 1 or 2 stories, as Chuck talked about, and he did structure response, little example with coffee cup, frequency and particle velocity dependent, but all those other structures have different types of different abilities to withstand seismic impact. All right, and so how do we build that into the system? All right, so when we first published our rules, we decided, okay, this is pretty tough to do this on national level. And we said, okay, we're gonna give you 3 options to comment on. And I wanna review each one of those 3 options because it illustrates the importance of looking at frequency, particle velocity, and structure type. Option 1 that they provided was a chart over here with different types of structures that had different particle velocity limits at different frequencies. So for example, for structure 1, okay, sensitive or protected structures such as a historic building, monument, and residence with construction elements such as plaster interiors and rough stone foundation walls. That's a whole lot more specific than some of the stuff that Chuck talked about, okay? Across the board, 1 inch per second, or half an inch a second. Structure 2, older homes, more than 20 years old. Okay, more than 20 years old. So that means the RI 8507 was in 1980. So that means any house built in 1960 or earlier, basically. And that would hold true today. Okay, that's still the age that you would draw the line at, in my mind, anyways. Older construction elements such as plaster and lath interiors or deteriorated, rigid, and easily fractured construction materials. So item 2, 3/4 of an inch per second, under 10, 1 inch at 10 to 40 hertz, and 2 inches over 40 hertz. Item 3, modern homes, less than 20 years old. Okay, I'm not going to read that, but it's the newer gypsum wallboard type of construction. Those were 1 inch, less than 10 hertz, 1.5, 10 to 40, and 2 inches at anything greater than 40 hertz. Structure 4 type, structures with safety considerations such as water towers, impoundments, tunnels, pipelines, and underground mines. So utilities, basically, for simplicity, would have a 2 inch per second limit, 2 inches per second, 2 inches per second limit across the board. And then for buildings designed to resist structure dynamic loads such as earthquakes, wind, and traffic, it just leaves them open-ended. So those are basically engineered structures as a general rule. So the regulator had to evaluate not only the structure type, but also the frequency and modify the particle velocity based on that. It's a lot of work. Or they could use these scale distance factors over here that equated to these particle velocities that are mentioned in the chart on the right-hand side. Okay? So it's a rather complex system to do that. You had to keep track of all the individual types of houses that were in the neighborhood. Option 2, simply went with a distance to structure from the blast site. At various distances, they specified different allowable particle velocities. Well, what does distance bring into this equation? It brings in frequency. Generally speaking, close in, ground vibrations from blasting are high frequency. At more distant relationships, they're lower frequencies. So as with increasing distance, frequencies decrease, and the allowable particle velocities at those distances also decrease. All right? Or you could use this equation here, which is a different form than what we're accustomed to looking at, to determine the allowable charge weight. All right? Here again, this doesn't really cover the types of frequencies or the types of buildings. It just covers the frequencies and the particle velocities. The third option was just the US Bureau of Mines Z-curve that was developed in Appendix B, or a flat peak particle velocity of 1 inch per second, or an allowable charge weight based on a scale distance of 55. So those were the three things we proposed. This does not include frequency in any way, shape, or form. This does not include frequency in any way, shape, or form, or structure type, but this certainly includes frequency as well as particle velocity, and structure type based on the two-tiered approach, the Z-curve. All right, and we asked the industry and the public at large, well, what should we use? Got tons and tons and tons of comments back. And we ultimately settled on this approach here. We went back based on the comments and said, which is a huge outcry in response to 8507, and we can't live by that. We came up with a modified Z-curve over here, where we broke this line at this point here at 11 hertz, and this one here at 30, which is contrary to the 13 and 40 breakpoints on the Bureau of Mines Z-curve. And we adopted a two-fold approach over here for ground vibration control based on distance, 0 to 300, high frequency vibrations, 1.25 inches per second, 300 to 5,000 feet, 1 inch per second, and anything over 5,000 feet. Allowable particle velocity was 0.75. Where they came up with this 5,000 number, I have no idea. One great thing about the preambles of the federal rules is they explain what they were thinking at that point in time. I cannot find anywhere in the literature why they picked 1,000. I'm sure most of you are aware that low frequency ground vibrations certainly occur well before that point in time, probably somewhere around 1,000 feet. Then there was also a scale distance counterpart, 50, 55, and 65 here, that equated to these different distances, frequency concern versus limiting ground vibration, and particle velocity and scale distance are tied together with that equation to get these comparable values here. And that's where we are today, okay, from OSM's perspective. Here's that chart, a little bit more well-defined. They apply to dwellings, public buildings, schools, churches, community, or institutional buildings, all right? The regulatory authority is still responsible to lower those limits if necessary to ensure damage prevention. Okay, so they've got to look at the buildings on occasion and decide if there's a more appropriate limit or not. They can obtain those by virtue of pre-blast surveys, public comment during permit application or whatever. But as they become aware of more sensitive structures, they have the latitude and responsibility to lower those vibration limits. All right. In terms of other structures in our regulatory scheme, water towers, power lines, any of the utilities category, they're responsible for approving limits to ensure that those properties, public or private, are protected as well. Some places simply apply these limits to those other structures as well. It depends on how people have written their regulatory program. All right. So where are we at this stage of the game? What's the difference? Well, the Bureau of Mines Z-curve is here. The OSM modification is right there, the orange line. When you introduce the ground vibration standards for particle velocity between 0 and 300 feet, assuming high frequencies, a peak particle velocity of 1.25. For mid-range frequencies, particle velocity of 1 inch per second is appropriate. And below 11 hertz, a particle velocity of 0.75 is appropriate within our regulatory scheme. Each one of these lines in the sand roughly provide an equivalent level of damage protection or prevention. They're basically equally protected from a probability standpoint. You can be in compliance with one line and out of compliance with another. They're fundamentally equally compliant, but there are instances where some damage can occur below, especially the red lines as well. And in my regulatory program, the RA or OSM is responsible for evaluating those situations on a case-by-case basis and adjusting the limits accordingly. All right? So, where did we end up here? OSM was the first agency to adopt the modification, USBM 8507. All the coal mining states adopted our rules quickly. For other blasting, other than coal mining, though, a lot of the states just kept the 2 inch per second limit. That's very appropriate probably for many construction-related activities in close proximity to homes where the frequencies are high. All right. Soon after, IME adopted the rules and FPA adopted those rules, okay? But over time, when you go to court these days, the Z-curve is pretty much filtered back in. The original Z-curve from the Bureau of Mines has come back to RAIN. That's the gauge that everybody is using at this point in time to determine whether or not there's a possibility of damage. While OSM started this all and everybody else adopted it, the legal side of the house has sort of brought it back to the original version that was there. And then since that had happened, IME or ISEE had an initiative that changed or made a recommendation to NFPA that resulted in them changing their rules, and IME also changed their recommendations as well. So what happened at that point in time? Everybody went back, except for OSM. We haven't gone back and redone our rules just yet. They've gone back to the original Z-curve that you see here. Some states have simply adopted this lower line without consideration of the dash line up here for plaster for drywall related structures, okay? But by and large, the current best science currently available is this particular graphic itself. Is it easily attainable in the field? You bet. All the seismographs that we've currently got provide this information readily in the field on a day-by-day basis, whereas in the 80s, that simply didn't necessarily occur. So now it's a viable option. And the other options, such as scale distance, have been modified, okay? To these levels here, 50, 55, and 55, or 55 and 65, but at 1,000 feet instead of 5,000 feet. That's where we currently stand at this point in time. So, where are we after 40 years? The Z-curve is alive and well. It's come back into our view full circle. Provides for a high probability of dawn damage. Used in a lot of legal cases. Adopted by all the professional societies at this point in time. Easily used with the blasting seismographs, and many states have adopted it. And what are the keys that these all consider? Particle velocity, frequency, and structure type. You've got to take a look at all three of those to minimize the potential for damage in any given situation. So with that, I hope you have a little better understanding of the regulatory process and how the US Bureau of Mines 8507 and the Z-curve was brought into our current regulatory scheme to address the prevention of damage to all public and private property in close proximity to blasting applications. Questions?
So Ken, this question might be just as equally applied to Chuck, but at the time this is being developed, did folks at US Bureau of Mines have any idea how pervasive this Z-curve would become as that was being developed?
At that point in time, I would say no. You know, I mean, last year at the annual conference, you know, we inducted Dave Siskin into the Hall of Fame. He had no idea. Did you guys ever have any idea that it would come to this level? And he was surprised. I mean, you know, his wife, bless us all, you know, was just floored that he's like, you did that? You know, she couldn't believe that, you know, something so prominent that he did could have gained that much industry recognition. And so, no, I think it was very, very much a surprise. And Chuck's nodding his head up here.
So do you think there's any hope for the future that we're going to look at displacement as a criteria moving forward, or are we going to be married to 8507 for the foreseeable future?
It's going to depend on the amount of research that is done by industry and universities at this stage of the game. Having lost the Bureau of Mines, you know, for me as a regulator, and you know, you'd like to do your own in-house research, which was what the Bureau of Mines was able to provide us. We simply don't have that resource as a tool. There's not money being provided to universities as a general to conduct that type of research. From an OSM standpoint, when they passed the act, they provided us with $5 million of research money to focus on reclamation, environmental protection related issues. After about 10 years, they took it away from us and said, you know, you're not a research group. We should give that to Bureau of Mines. And they gave it to the Bureau of Mines. Well, what happened to Bureau of Mines? 10 years later, they went away. Did that research money ever come back to us? No. And what's even worse is they told us that, you know, you can't conduct research. So if I want to do a special study, as long as I call it applied research, or yeah, no, as long as I call it an applied science study, you know, I'm okay, but I can't call it research. So anyways, you know, to answer your question, you know, and to the extent that Chuck or anybody else in this room or the universities can do the research to justify that, it's not going to happen. But once that research is available, then it's simply a matter of coming back and petitioning us to change our rules based on the new information that's available, and we would have to entertain that. And I can't guarantee that we would change it, but that's the way the process works.
Well, I think then it's incumbent upon those of us that are emerging professionals to start really concepting how strain-based limits will have a role and presence in the future.
Absolutely. I would strongly encourage that at this point in time, because that's the only place that the work is going to get done. It's got to come from within at this stage of the game. Unfortunately, you know, the government's not there to help out in this instance as much anymore. Any other thoughts on that, Chuck, by chance? Yeah, I tell you what, how about if you come up here and at this point in time, we can just sort of, you know, jointly, you know, talk about some of this stuff.
While Chuck's going up there, I just want to say that, you know, when they did this original research, all they had was geophones, accelerometers. There wasn't anything that really measure displacement, okay? And because what they had was voltmeters, basically, the seismographs at that time. So, okay, that was a real problem for them, and they looked at acceleration and PPV gave the best correlation. And then as they advanced, they realized that, well, okay, PPV is also dependent on frequency, right? So if you want to differentiate velocity, okay, we'll take it straight in there to get acceleration. For a sinusoidal wave, there's 2 pi f in there as well as the velocity to get acceleration, okay? So that's where it was. I don't think they had anything to reliably do any displacement measurement, okay, in those days.
No, that was part of what Bulletin 656 had looked at, and some of the earlier research, that the best equipment to use for vibration monitoring and damage control was a velocity meter, simply because the equipment for displacement wasn't available at that point in time. Okay, so
One comment with regard to strain. There is another profession, the earthquake engineering group, that uses structural dynamics. And so an enormous amount of money is being deployed by the federal government in earthquake engineering research. And a lot of those studies can be applied to what we do with blasting vibrations, because structural dynamics, the mathematics of that applies to both blasting vibrations and earthquakes, because structures respond in similar fashions and can be shown to mathematically respond in the same way. So I would recommend that going forward, what we need to do is take more advantage of the earthquake engineering advances than we have in the past.
anything else? Thank you.
Hey, thank you.